right. Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Markowski and this is Sharper Pen. We discuss image consulting, including people's appearance, behavior, and communication, which includes, at least here, thinking. So in turn, we do a lot of cultural and literary analysis. And today we will be following up on French postmodernist writer Jean Baudrillard's novel America. Technically, it's not a novel. It's a philosophy book, a social, political, anthropological work, I think you'd call it. Anyway, Baudrillard's take on America, if you're not familiar with him, his work, European philosophy and history, it'll very much read like an alien's look, an outsider's look, looking in from outside. I think a lot of Americans would deny what he says, or wouldn't understand what he says, or would laugh and identify totally with what a lot of what he says. But at the same time, it's definitely an outsider's perspective. It's definitely an outsider's take on what America looks like, and to Americans who have lived their whole lives here, they don't recognize just how strange and giddily insane the American really is. So Baudrillard is going to get into it. And note, when I say giddily insane, I just mean, into their hyper reality, into their matrix. It's not a moral judgment. It's not any judgment. It's just what Baudrillard and also I have recognized here. And before we begin, a quick kind of guideline as to how I work on the channel. I'm not here to sum up people's books or ideas or works or lives. I'm not here to do people's book reports or do the cliff notes. It's all about the reading, it's all about the interpretation. So, if you haven't read the book, you should read it first yourself. And then if not, and you just kind of want to see what I'm doing here, it's just interpretation. It's not coming to the text assuming we know the answers or that there's only going to be one answer to get. It's just being open to what's being said. And the only way to really read an author and to understand an author is to be open to what's being said. So, to start, I'm just going to make some few generalizations. First and foremost is to realize that to Baudrillard is in terms of what he's saying in the book, is that America is utopia realized. While the rest of the world was struggling and fighting and chasing their whatever the vision or the dream or the political schema was through all time, America just made it happen. That might seem a bit vague or confusing, but we're going to get into the details. Specifically, it became so successful that basically processes ran away. This is late modernity, right? It's not just everything simplified and rationalized. Life is a series of rational steps. It's not just industrialization and factorialization of the world. It's also the hyper reality of it, meaning that America, like its actors and its politicians, loom larger than life. So, and basically it's a country of a hologram. So, in just even in this image right here on the screen, if you look at that cactus, that's a saguaro cactus. And you can look in Arizona and California all you want for one of those that looks just like that one. You will not find the saguaro with the perfect three prongs. However, that image right there, that three-pronged saguaro, that becomes the reality. It becomes realer than real. It becomes a hologram, a representation, a hyper representation rather. So instead of and to give you an example of what this means for America, it means like, okay, here in California, LA and its palm trees and a sunset, there's an image of all America. New York, with or without the Twin Towers, there's America, right? And then even you narrow it down to here's a rusted out trailer and a old truck and a dog sleeping in the yard, and there's another image of America that tells you the whole story of America. So our country has become this kind of monolithic image. And then our actors and our media basically represent that and enact that. From there, he says America kind of succeeded with integration, like integrating as many people and things as possible. especially because, if you understand America, they didn't really invent anything new. They brought old European ideas and then just kind of enacted it here, and without anyone to stop them, they took over the globe basically. But he kind of recognizes this, and despite all its problems and the fighting and the urge for this and that revolution, new or old, Baudrillard's already realizing it kind of doesn't matter because this has already kind of happened, and these people have been living and dying and arising here for hundreds of years now, and it kind of resulted in this mishmash of a spectacle. Even though there's very particular powers and systems in place, that the whole of it is this spectacular, larger than life image where we aren't just a simulated nation, but the world's first simulated people. If you understand, like a media people, a people born and raised to tend to the machinery. At the highest, it's media and image production, and at the bottom, it's you're digging ditches behind the scenes. You're doing the not sexy labor. You're doing the labor that's not fun, that none of the intellectuals want to do and none of the other classes want to do. That's what goes on behind the scenes. So that's the banality everywhere. And lastly, main point for now is this is in the late 80s that Baudrillard's writing this book, America. So, what he says about us is that we're computerized people. We're increasingly synchronized, connected, taking over the globe. So he realizes this about us. And kind of beginning there is probably a good place to begin because he says that our biggest fear is the lights going out. And I tend to agree, it's just the electricity going out because without that, how would you keep Americans busy? Yeah, some of them jog a lot, some of them waste their energy any number of ways, but the main way people are, entertained and kept busy is electricity. So, Baudrillard begins here where we're starting. The obsessive fear of the Americans is that the lights might go out. Lights are left on all night in the houses. In the tower blocks, the empty offices remain lit. On the freeways in broad daylight, the cars keep all their headlights on. In Palms Avenue, Venice, California, a little grocery store that sells beer in a part of town where no one on the streets after 7 p.m. leaves its orange and green neon sign flashing all night into the void. And this is not to mention the television with its 24-hour schedules, often to be seen functioning like an hallucination in an empty room of houses or vacant hotel rooms or everywhere these days, right? As in the Porterville Hotel where the curtains were torn, the water cut off, and the door swinging in the wind. But on the fluorescent screen in each of the rooms, a TV commentator was describing the takeoff of the space shuttle. There's nothing more mysterious than a TV set left on in an empty room. It is even stranger than a man talking to himself or a woman standing dreaming over her stove, as if it was another planet is communicating with you. Um, some other is what he's implying there, outer forces. Suddenly, the TV reveals itself for what it really is, a video of another world, ultimately addressed to no one at all, right? To everybody and nobody, delivering its images indifferently, indifferent to its own messages. You can easily imagine it still functioning after humanity has disappeared, right? Just take on forms and shapes of its own. Maybe it just kind of starts looking like AI video. In short, in America, the arrival of nighttime or periods of rest cannot be accepted, nor can the Americans bear to see this, right? We can't sit still. We're busy, busy little bees. Americans bear to see the technological process halted. Everything has to be working all the time. This is true. Everything has to be working all the time. There has to be no let up in man's artificial power. And I noted here a fear of the dark, a fear of aloneness, a fear of quiet. It really captures the isolation, the desert that is American culture. It's a million miles wide, but an inch deep, so you couldn't drown yourself in it to get rid of yourself. You couldn't disappear into it. Baudrillard talks about that's kind of the madness of the health nuts here and the people who jog for hours a day or run up and down stair steppers hours a day, right? That it's just an utter waste of time, energy, and life. And yet these people have the wealth, the time, the energy, the food to enact this giant waste. If you can imagine all of our gyms like giant, kind of like giant hamster wheels, right, of just human energy, but instead of powering something or doing anything, they're just burning off energy. But, that is our culture, as Baudrillard's illustrating, right? There has to be no let up in man's artificial power. Um, Worth noting, he mentions that about the marathon. There's this idea, I did it, we did it, that hundreds of, tens of thousands of people running this pointless race to pointless ends just for mindless self-indulgence, right? Quick interjection here. I mentioned Baudrillard mentioning the running of the marathon, and I thought it was so hilarious I wanted to include it in so you could understand what he meant. And he's talking about American trends and fads, from breakdancing to work to whatever it is. And he says, I would never have believed that the New York Marathon could move you to tears. It really is it really is the end of the world show. Can we speak of suffering freely entered into as we might speak of a state of servitude freely entered into? In driving rain with helicopters circling overhead and the crowd cheering, wearing aluminum foil capes and squinting at their stopwatches, their eyes rolling skywards, they are all seeking death. That death by exhaustion that was the fate of the first marathon man some 2,000 years ago. And he, let us not forget, was carrying a message of victory to Athens. They also dream, no doubt, of bringing a victory message, but there are too many of them and their message has lost all meaning. It is merely the message of their arrival, at the end of their exertions, the twilight message of a futile, superhuman effort. Collectively, they might rather seem to be bringing the message of a catastrophe for the human race, which you can see becoming more and more decrepit by the hour as the runners come in. From the competitive athletic types who arrive first to the wrecks who are literally carried to the finishing line by their friends or the handicapped who do the race in their wheelchairs, there are 17,000 marathon runners, and you can't help thinking back to the Battle of Marathon, where there weren't even 17,000 soldiers in the field. Right? What a pretension, what a show. There are 17,000 of them, and each one runs alone, without even a thought for victory, but simply in order to feel alive. We won, gasps the man from Marathon as he expires, right? The Athenian. I did it, sighs the exhausted marathon runner of New York as he collapses on the grass in Central Park. And the all caps here, I did it! The slogan of a new form of advertising activity, of autistic performance, a pure and empty form, a challenge to one's own self that has replaced the Promethean ecstasy of competition, effort, and success. The New York Marathon has become a sort of interventional symbol of such fetishistic performance, of the mania for an empty victory, the joy engendered by a feat that is of no consequence whatsoever. I added the whatsoever, just kind of emphasizing Baudrillard's point here. You see the self-absorbed squander of just the wastage of so many bodies, energy, because these people otherwise have nothing else to do. They literally have nothing better to do, or they might be actually doing that. I ran the New York Marathon. I did it. I conquered Annapurna. I did it. The moon landing is the same kind of thing. We did it. The event was ultimately not really so surprising. It was an event pre-programmed into the course of science and progress. We did it. But it has not revived the millennium dream of conquering space. In a sense, it has exhausted it. So there you see Baudrillard's sense of things. And with that, we'll get back to the video. So, in the intermittent character of natural cycles, the seasons, day and night, heat and cold, has to be replaced by a functional continuum that is sometimes absurd. Deep down, there's the same refusal of the intermittent nature of true and false. Everything is true, and of good and evil, everything is good. You may seek to explain this in terms of fear, perhaps obsessional fear, or say that this unproductive expenditure is an act of mourning, but what is absurd is also admirable, right? To burn off all that energy. The skylines lit up at the dead of night, the air conditioning systems cooling empty hotels in the desert, and artificial light in the middle of day all have something both demented and admirable about them. The mindless luxury of a rich civilization, and yet of a civilization perhaps as sacred to see or as scared to see the lights go out as was the hunter in the primitive night. I think our lights actually blot out the scariness of looking up at the void if you know what the Milky Way looks like, if you've ever seen it without light pollution. A lot of people never have and probably never will, and then for all of humanity's evolution, we were looking up into this overwhelming psychedelic image of the universe. So I think modern people, they see a gray sky instead of a colorful Milky Way splashed across, as far as the eye can see. So going on here. There's some truth in this, but what is striking is the fascination with artifice, with energy and space. Not only natural space, space is spacious in their heads as well, which came to be manifest in cyberspace. So now we have technically infinite space to build. Like I talked about in previous videos, you take the city, condense it down, and now it looks like a microchip with all its little structures and buildings and pathways, right? And that's a model of our civilization and our communication in a nutshell. So okay, so I read this part last time in the first video about all great world powers having their avenues that you look down them and you see that miniature representation of the infinitude of empire, right? For us as a technological global civilization, it's the microchip. But this was before that kind of culmination had been reached in Baudrillard's time. So he's saying with us, it's Washington, D.C., it's California in the desert, it's all these utopian visions and places where you can find the universe reflected in the microcosm of its structures and buildings and museums and all that artifice, right? Preserving what was already destroyed. If you can think of like a museum about Native Americans. What Baudrillard gets to is an important part that our scholars and our media and no one else will show you. And as someone who's road tripped all over America before, it's something I have to tell the viewers, especially if you're not American and you're not familiar with our country. Baudrillard writes, drive 10,000 miles across America and you will know more about the country than all the institutes of sociology and political science put together. And I'd say the media itself, because the media shows you the image of the reality, and the reality is a lot more banal. It's just people living their lives, but you'll see a wide variation because we are a different country, coast to coast, state to state, city to city, family to family, right? We are a weird species. The American is a weird and different species than this planet has ever seen before. So now we're coming to another important part in Baudrillard's work here, and that's to say that America is utopia achieved, utopia realized, right? I mentioned this in the beginning, and the question is, what do I mean by that? And again, if Europe basically invented history, right, from the Western Anglosphere perspective, right, because this gets into different sects and peoples and it's not all one thing or one story, right? Um, but basically, what he means is that if Europe had invented history with its religions and dialectics and theories, including the theory of history, and we're talking specifically Hegel, Kant, getting into Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, right? What exactly is going on with these beings here? What are they really up to? You know, Baudrillard's recognizing that for all this talk that the Europeans have been doing forever, right before they blew up and ended what was classical or old Europe in the mid 20th century, World War II, let's say, World War One. But they had been shedding their old identities before that. Baudrillard's saying, for all that, America just made it happen. We don't talk about concepts and intellectual ideas. We see if we can make them happen or not. In America, you either materialize it or it's not real. Either go big or go home. And specifically, I'm from the show me state, so it's really in our DNA, not just me personally, but Americans. It's all around us. Appearance is reality. Don't look any deeper, just the image. If it doesn't look real, it's not real. And if it looks fake, it's definitely fake. And then how do you tell on America? How do you tell in a country like America where everything's fake? Well, kind of gets to the point. There's nothing to figure out. There's nothing to do. The revolution happened. The humans won. The rights are won. The money is won. We won forever. The lights will be on until the end, right? They're not going to go out. No one would let them go out. Let's get into the details of all that. Let's see what it looks like to, rather than fantasize about Plato's Utopia, what happens when we actually build Christ's heaven on earth. For the European, even today, America represents something akin to exile, a fantasy of emigration and therefore a form of interiorization of his own culture, right? Escaping away to a foreign land, but you're carrying your own ownness, your own selfness there because what else is there? At the same time, it corresponds to a violent extroversion, and therefore to the zero degree of that same culture, right? America is highly extrovertive, right? As a culture, they're loud, outgoing, annoying, abrasive, obnoxious in our politics, in our media, in our YouTube, in our content. Doesn't matter where you go. Americans are there to pee on fence posts, to bump up against each other, to disrespect other people's culture, and to generally say we're the best and we beat you to the punch. So it corresponds to this violent extroversion and therefore to the zero degree of that same culture. No other country embodies to the same extent both this function of disincarnation and at the same time, and it's funny, in mediums, remember this is a medium, a culture of mediums, so not books, but radio, TV, and now internet. On these mediums were disincarnated beings. As McLuhan observed, they got the light to go right through us. They turned us into beings who also carry, basically, we're all ants working for the light speed ant colony, carrying little bits of light or data or information, if you will. So, um, disincarnation and at the same time the functions of exacerbation and radicalization of the elements of the European cultures. Right, so those old ideals didn't get away, they just go underground and they change shape and form. So, whether fascism, communism, they don't die, they just kind of haunt the place. So it is by an act of force or coup d'etat, the geographical exile of the founding fathers of the 17th century, adding itself to the voluntary exile of man within his own consciousness, that what in Europe had remained a critical and religious esotericism became transformed on the new continent into a pragmatic exotericism, right? So rather than a personal religious endeavor, even think like with like the Reformation, right? That now we're all individually responsible for our own salvation, more or less. The whole foundation of America is a response to this dual operation of a deepening of the moral law in individual consciences, a radicalization of the utopian demand, which was always that of the sex and of the immediate materialization of that utopia in work, custom, and way of life. To land in America is even today to land in that religion of the way of life of which de Tocqueville described. Now, we talked about him before. French aristocrat came to America, said, "What's going on with the Americans? What's the difference between them and us?" Da da da. And basically, he realized, like, hey, these are an industrious, moral people who are into spectacle and exaggeration, and they like entertainment, rude and abrasive, crass and uncultured, but they're just kind of like this, right? They're very extroverted. Um, so I guess it's kind of like that. Those excess, obsolete cultures and classes of people could come over here and try and find a place to live. And then, as a country who needed entertainment, right, from the ceaseless labor, so, this material utopia way of life where success and action are seen as profound illustrations of the moral law. Right. Remember, you're bad if you don't have money. It proves that you weren't an industrious American, unlike our founding fathers who came here and bootstrapped themselves up by their bootstraps, so everyone else could learn to bootstrap by their bootstraps. This is the scene he's discussing. Were crystallized by exile and emigration, and these have, in a sense, transformed it into a primal scene. For us in Europe, it was Revolution of 1789 that set its seal upon us, though it was a different seal, that of history, the state, and ideology. Politics and history, not the utopian moral sphere, remain our primal scene. And if this transcendent European style revolution is far more confident today either of its means or its ends, the same cannot be said of the imminent revolution of the American way of life, of that moral and pragmatic assertiveness which constitutes now as ever the pathos of the New World. America is the original version of modernity. Right. And in terms of this utopia and all these cults and sects and kind of what that's all about, is that I would suggest to anyone here read Ben Franklin's autobiography, not to learn about how he was into lusty strumpets and loose women, but to learn about how the founding of religious sects, that European idealism, that European cultishness, that since the very beginning, that was alive and well here. In modern times, that's UFO cults, that's cults of celebrity, that's finding an influencer, that's finding a coach, that's all. But again, what Baudrillard's saying, it's long been a part of our way of life, track through the last few centuries here. So, this is modernity. America invented it, or if it was on the verge of happening, if it was the imminence that Europeans had been chasing after all along, some sort of, I don't know, if you can't have heaven in reality, might as well at least have it on earth. America made it happen with its material success. So, we are dubbed, and he's talking of Europe. Europe is the dubbed or subtitled version of modernity, right? They're too sophisticated, too into their suffering, too introverted, too aristocratic in sensibilities versus our outward social nature. America ducks the question of origins, right? There's the other thing he says about us, a culture of no culture, a culture of no origin. It cultivates no origin or mythological authenticity. It has no past and no founding truth. It kind of had Western movies once, but having known no primitive accumulation of time, right? No century, no long centuries, no millennium, just having no primitive accumulation of time, it lives in a perpetual present. That is modernity. Having seen no slow centuries long accumulation of a principle of truth, all right, we just interchange them, right? Like changing the tires, change the workers, change the work. It's all to be obsolesced. It's all to be replaced, right? Perpetual present. Having seen no slow centuries-long accumulation, it lives in perpetual simulation, in a perpetual present of signs, right? That's the media, that's our representation. It has no ancestral territory. The Indians' territory of today is marked off in reservations, the equivalent of the galleries in which American stocks its Rembrandts and Renoirs, its Degas and its Van Goghs. We got some of that here in Pasadena, but this is of no importance, right? Baudrillard calls it kitschy, that Americans just kind of collect whatever from wherever and open up a Campbell soup house and call it a museum, right? This is culture for Americans. America has no identity problem. In the future, power will belong to those people with no origins and no authenticity who know how to exploit that situation. Right. This is cyberpunk. This is, identity and culture itself becoming liabilities just to making money and taking over the globe and ruling forever with technology and military. Right. So, kind of going forward, we have no identity problem here. These days, I think we're kind of having that reckoning, or these things are boiling over. So I think Baudrillard would be heartened to see that America does have some spirit inside of it that's not just mere simulation. Um, and he says, look at Japan as the example, right? They shed their cultures and customs to embrace uh, not just a corporate system, but also the Phoenician alphabet, which was interesting because Marshall McLuhan predicted in the 60s that Japan would collapse before Japan even rose, right? Just as Japan was beginning to rise, he could see, oh, they're following our model, which means they can only collapse into themselves. So, which to a certain extent has pulled off this trick better than the US itself, managing in what seems to us an unintelligible paradox to transform the power of territoriality and feudalism into that of deterritoriality and weightlessness, right? You think just cruising down the American freeway forever. Think of cruising down the mountain. Think of sitting at the beach and watching the oceans go. Think of just Netflixing and chilling. Think of watching an old cinema from the 1920. Think of watching a new cinema from the 1990s, right? It's all this just ebb and flow of ceaseless present that then becomes our future nostalgia as the next generations come up. So, weightlessness. Japan is already a satellite of the planet Earth, but America was already in its day a satellite of the planet Europe. Bingo, we didn't just come out of nowhere. We didn't just have a beginning. We came from Europe. So, and also again, interesting to note, he noticed that the future where hiddenness and disappearing becomes more important than identity and culture, those are the people who will benefit, who know how to hide, who know how to manipulate, right? So, whether we like it or not, the future has shifted towards artificial satellites. The US is utopia achieved. We should not judge their crisis as we would judge our own, according to standards of class and style and taste and history and cultural heritage. No, in America, it's just, again, the show me state. Give me the money. I just know when we just want to know where the gold's at. So the crisis of the old European countries. Ours is a crisis of historical ideals facing up to the impossibility of their realization, right? He's talking about the failure of European idealism through the ages, right? That in reality, I guess it's called, in sociology, it has a theory. It's Nietzschean in nature, but it's called, I think, the power theory, or the elites theory, basically that a organized few, a conspiracy, will rule over a disorganized mass, the herd, right? So he's basically saying what they really floundered at, America could at least provide for. Theirs is the crisis of achieved utopia. We already made it happen. This place is already a paradise, right? We got all the food in the world, all the entertainment in the world, all the toys in the world, oh, and all the guns in the world. So, what more could you need? Confronted with the problem of its duration and permanence, theirs is the crisis of achieved utopia, confronted with the problem of its duration and permanence, right? So, what does a utopia change into? What does it, right? Just like a democracy changes over time, as Aristotle discussed, what does a utopia turn into? So, the Americans are not wrong in their idyllic conviction that they are at the center of the world, the supreme power, the absolute model for everyone. And this conviction is not so much founded on natural resources, technologies, and arms as on the miraculous premises of a utopia made reality, of a society which, with a directness we might judge unbearable, is built on an idea that it is the realization of everything the others have dreamt of: justice, plenty, rule of law, wealth, freedom. It knows this. Oh, and guns, and beer, and milk, and honey. It believes in it, and in the end, the others have come to believe in it too, right? And Cadillacs. In the present crisis of values, everyone ends up turning towards the culture which dared to forge right ahead and by a theatrical masterstroke turn those values into reality, right? Beat you to the punch. We'll take your Nazi scientists, we'll take your Christianity, kind of pick and choose. That's what America's really good at. So, towards that society which, thanks to the geographical and mental break affected by emigration, allowed itself to imagine it could create an ideal world from nothing. Right? We made the Big Bang began with us. The universe began with us. The world began with America. And Baudrillard gets into this. He says that basically you can't even start with Europe anymore. You kind of got to start with America and work backwards to understand both history and the end of history, as Europe and America kind of made that happen. We should also not forget the fantasy consecration of this process by the cinema. Whatever happens and whatever one thinks of the arrogance of the dollar of the multinationals, it is this culture which, the world over, fascinates those very people who suffer most at its hands. Don't ask Vietnam. And it does so through the deep, insane conviction that it has made all their dreams come true. Right, and this is kind of in terms of symbolic exchange for not just Americans, but the rest of the world. What can you even give back when the world and creation and, again, milk, honey, TV, internet, when so much was given to you, what could you ever give back to pay it back? The answer is you can't. Everyone the world over is in permanent debt here. So Tocqueville describes the beneficial effects of democracy on the American Constitution. See, I don't want to necessarily get into this. So this is where he starts drawing those dividing lines. What are the differences between European and American ideals, and what are the differences between these countries and these people? And he says, it is moreover extraordinary. He's observing how little we've changed since Tocqueville made his analysis of us back in the 1800s, if I recall. Much less than European societies, right? We haven't changed at all. Whereas these were caught up in the revolutions of the 19th century, the Americans kept intact, preserved it as way of breadth of ocean that created something akin to temporal insularity. The utopian and moral perspective of the men of the 18th century, or even of the Puritan sects of the 17th, transplanted, kept alive, safely sheltered from the vicissitudes of history. This Puritan and moral hysteresis is that of exile, that of utopia. We criticize them for this. Why did the revolution not take place here, in this new country, this land of liberty and advanced bastion of capitalism? Why do the social and the political, our favored categories, have so little purchase here? The answer is that the social and philosophical 19th century did not cross the Atlantic, and here the driving forces are utopia and morality. The concrete idea of happiness and mores, all of which political ideology with Marx at its head, liquidated in Europe in favor of an objective conception of historical transformation. It is from this point of view that we tax Americans with historical naivete and moral hypocrisy, but the fact is simply that, in their collective consciousness, they are closer to the models of thought of the 18th century, which are utopian and pragmatic, than to those that were to be imposed by the French Revolution, which were ideological and revolutionary. And remember, we started with revolution, but quickly turned back to republicanism. So the utopia was, that revolution was a bait and switch. It wasn't fighting off freedom. It was just business as usual, or fighting for freedom. It was business as usual. Nothing changed. Baudrillard was saying, de Tocqueville was saying that, this revolution of mores, this revolution of a way of life, the moral revolution uh, in America, that it doesn't create a new legality or a new state, right? It's not like they invented something new, but it does create a practical legitimacy, a legitimacy grounded in a way of life. Salvation no longer has to do with the divine of the state, but with the ideal form of practical organization. Is this to be traced back to the secularization of conscience affected by Protestantism, to the interjection of divine jurisdiction into daily discipline? The fact is that religion has become part of everyday life, which means that it can no longer be challenged or questioned as it is to its basis, since it no longer has transcendent value. This is religion as way of life. Similarly, politics has become part of everyday life, as pragmatic machine, as game, as interaction, as spectacle, which means that it can no longer be judged from a specifically political point of view. There's no ideological or philosophical principle of government anymore. Things are at once both more naive and more conjunctural. Kind of goes on about notorious American conformism, which we see as a sign of social and political weakness. But the fact is that the people are more united on concrete regulation than on an abstract legislation here, there in Europe. They are more agreed on informal ways of doing things than on formal authority, right? Self organizing, self caring. What could it mean to disassociate oneself from a rule to challenge a mechanism? You have to understand this conventional pragmatic solidarity of American customs, which is based not on social contract but on a kind of moral pact, but which might be compared not so much to the highway code, which anyone may disobey, as to the consensus that governs driving on the freeways. This conformity makes American society close to primitive societies in which it would be absurd to distinguish oneself morally by disobeying the collective ritual. Right. So it's understanding what the meta games are, what the meta rituals are. American conformism is not therefore naive. It is a product of a pact at the level of custom, of a set of rules and procedures which presuppose quasi-spontaneous adherence. Whereas our lives, as Europeans, by contrast, are governed by an equally ritualized disobedience of our own value system. Right? They get a thrill in being prigs and then in breaking the rules, or increasingly not caring, as what kind of happened with America. um, so, and it's funny, I had a note here, actually, an excerpt from Emerson's Self-Reliance, where Emerson writes, and if you don't know Ralph Waldo Emerson, America is not a I meant to put this at the beginning of the video, what America is and what it isn't, what Baudrillard thinks it is. America is not we're not a country of scholars and intellectuals. We're not about that. We never have been. Most of our writers and our media reflects this. It's not art, it's entertainment, it's filling the TV schedule, it's writing to occupy someone's time. The point is to say that he's one of our few intellectual figures. He's very European. He almost doesn't belong. And that's why he talks of self-reliance and conformity. In this case, this is in 1841. He wrote in his essay Self-Reliance, society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder. Right? This is what Baudrillard was talking about, right? We're all agreeing to use the freeway. The highway code is up to you, and you might get a ticket or someone might road rage on you, but we're at least all on the freeway. So, Uh, there it is. For the better securing is bread to each shareholder, to surrender the liberty and the culture of the eater. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. It loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. So that's what he's saying. Conformity loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. And I wrote in America, well, that's exactly the opposite of what it's actually like and what people are really trained to do because, there's only a few things you can do to actually live or survive here. So that kind of limits people's options immensely. Here we are with Baudrillard. He's been examining our politics, our culture, and he kind of asks, is this really what an achieved utopia looks like? Is this a successful revolution? Yes, indeed. What do you expect a successful revolution to look like? It is a paradise. Santa Barbara is a paradise. Disneyland is a paradise. The US is a paradise. Here in California, especially Pasadena, it's a paradise. A lot of the valley, a lot of California and Southern California is not a paradise. It's like little Bangladesh or little India, but certain parts are definitely a paradise. But he says, paradise is just paradise. Mournful, monotonous, and superficial though it may be, it is paradise. There is no other. If you are prepared to accept the consequences of your dreams, right, that's the consequences that go with getting on the freeway and our suicidal murder mobiles, not just the political and sentimental ones, but the theoretical and cultural ones as well, then you must still regard America today with the same naive enthusiasm as the generations that discovered the New World. That same enthusiasm which Americans themselves now show for their own success, their own barbarism, their own power. If not, you have no understanding of the situation, and you will not be able to understand your own history or the end of your history, either because Europe can no longer be understood by starting out from Europe itself. The US is more mysterious. The mystery of America really exceeds our fictions and our interpretations. The mystery of a society which seeks to give itself neither meaning nor an identity, which indulges neither in transcendence nor in aesthetics, and which for precisely that reason invents the only great modern verticality in its buildings, which are the most grandiose manifestations within the vertical order and yet do not obey the rules of transcendence, which are the most prodigious pieces of architecture and yet do not obey the laws of aesthetics, which are ultra-modern and ultra-functional, but also have about them something non-speculative, primitive, and savage. Think of like building the monolith, right? The obelisk, something savage, a culture or unculture like this remains a mystery to us. We are at home with introversion and reflection, and with the different effects of meaning coexisting under the umbrella of a concept. In America, it's just no, 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 give me the banana. Give me the banana. We don't want to speculate on the banana. We don't want to theorize about the banana. We don't want to philosophize about the banana. Just show me the banana or go home. You know, banana or not. To banana or not to banana is America. But the object freed from its concept, free to deploy itself in extroverted form, just bananas in your face, is the equivalence of all its effects. To us, this is a total enigma, right? Europeans are too sophisticated to understand how simple Americans really are. They go too far. They look for invisible causes and concerns. We invented psychoanalysis and, fascism and socialism and Marxism. And it turns out none of these things actually apply to humans at scale. But it was a good effort. So Europe, Baudrillard kind of understands Europe hasn't been culturally relevant for decades. Most of the world is just copying America into modernity despite not having 19th centuries themselves. Um, and Baudrillard is recognizing the differences, this introverted culture over here of philosophy and art and aesthetics is in its own world compared to America, which exiled itself from that, and where we are not an intellectual culture, our aesthetics are ugly and kind of like the attitudes. And I'd say this, that I think some of Baudrillard's critique might have once applied, but is definitely broken down with the kind of general breakdown of American society over time. So he would be, because he calls us hopeless. So I think he would be glad to see us kind of emerging from our simulation. The idea that there's any life still happening here, the idea that like someone's alive, someone's aware, someone's noticing these massive changes in life and world around them, right? Like Baudrillard called us hopeless, but I see to the contrary that our panic culture has been giving rise to, I don't want to call it enlightened alienation, it's just systematic and de facto alienation. You can't have a utopia without alienating the self because the self is what concerns itself with death. And in America, we hide the cemeteries, we hide the old people, anyone who's not in the right age group and not discussing a very narrow range of concepts and ideas, right? We just get rid of all these people. It's like having too many, it's like being in Brave New World and having too many Bernards, right? We have way too many Bernards and they just don't mesh with our society. So it's paradise. We said that. Said it's an extroverted culture. And so about all this, Baudrillard says, to us it's a total enigma. Extroversion is a mystery to us exactly in the same way as the commodity was to Marx. The commodity hieroglyph of the modern world, mysterious precisely because it is extroverted, right? It's an object in the world. It's easy to form a value attachment to it, made equal with money or intelligence, a form realizing itself in its pure operation in its pure circulation. Hello, Carl. Right? We used to need the bait and switch. Now you don't need the bait and switch. What's it matter when everyone, as Nietzsche warns, of the paymaster, right? Everyone has been conditioned to believe in a paymaster when there's never been such a thing. Um, we are a post-production society, a consumer society. Oh, Marxism can only recede. Oh, you put a funny little joke here. Baudrillard says, "Hello, Carl," right? Kind of mocking the fact that this guy was, nice try, but he missed the mark by a long shot. Into the distance, while it simultaneously casts a forever haunting shadow over the future of capital. In this sense, for us, the whole of America is a desert. Culture exists there in a wild state. It sacrifices all intellect, all aesthetics in a process of literal transcription into the real. Said before. Doubtless the original decentering into virgin territory gave it its wildness, though it certainly acquires it without the agreement of the Indians whom it destroyed. The dead Indian remains the mysterious guarantor of those primitive mechanisms, even into the modern age of images and technologies. Perhaps the Americans who believed they had destroyed these Indians merely disseminated their virulence. They've opened up the deserts, threaded and crisscrossed them with their freeways, but by some mysterious interaction their towns and cities have taken on the structure and color of the desert. They've not destroyed space, they've simply rendered it infinite by the destruction of its center. Right? And in technological terms, again, on these mediums, we're disincarnated. When we're watching, we might as well be disincarnated. That could be TV, internet, or that could even be me broadcasting right here, right now. So they haven't destroyed space, we made it infinite, right, with cyberspace. They have simply rendered it infinite by the destruction of its centers, hence these infinitely extendable cities, and now microchips, right? If we don't need cities, then we got the microchips, and if we need cities, then we don't need, we'll need more microchips too, I guess. So in so doing, they have opened up a true fictional space. In the savage mind, too, that's in quotes, there is no natural universe, no transcendence of either man or nature or of history. Culture is everything or nothing, depending on how you look at it. You find the same absence of distinction between the two in modern simulation. There is no natural universe there either, and yet you cannot differentiate between a desert and a metropolis. It's not that the Indians were infinitely close to nature, nor that the Americans are infinitely distant from it. Both belong to the ideality of nature, as they do to the ideality of culture, and both are also equally alien to nature and culture. Whew. So there is no culture here, no cultural discourse, no ministries, no commissions, no subsidies, no promotions. There is none of the sickly cultural pathos. We've become increasingly that way, though, in late modernity here. I think the record keeping, all the data did it to us, which the whole of France indulges in, that fetishism of the cultural heritage, nor is there any of that sentimental, and today also status and protectionist invocation of culture. So he's saying we are the culture of no culture, the religion of no religion. One should speak rather of an anthropological culture which consists in the invention of mores and a way of life. That is the only interesting culture here, just it is New York streets and its museums or galleries that are interesting. Or he's saying in New York, it's the streets, not the museums and galleries that are interesting. And I'd say he's right. And honestly, here in California, same thing. It's the landscape and the cities themselves, even though you should or could check out the local museums. Um, Even in dance, cinema, the novel, fiction, and architecture, there is something wild in everything specifically American, yet something that has not known the glossy, high-flown rhetoric and theatricality of bourgeoisie cultures, that has not been kitted out in gaudy finery of cultural distinction. Here in the US, culture is not that delicious panacea which we Europeans consume in a sacramental mental space, right, introverted, and which has its own special columns in the newspapers and in people's minds. Culture is space, speed, cinema, technology. This culture is authentic if anything can be said to be authentic, right? The culture, so in the culture of no culture, we're authentic in that. Basically, just if you see a loudmouth American being a loudmouth American, even if it seems like it doesn't make sense, even if it violates their own laws and norms, just know that that's as authentic as it gets. That's American as can be. You got an idea, throw it at the wall, see if it'll stick, see if anything comes out of it. This is not cinema or speed or technology as optional extra. Everywhere in Europe, you get a sense of modernity as something tacked on, right? They had to make room for the modernity. They don't even have room for freeways, whereas you can like check out the channel here, got lots of footage of our freeways, and they're just never ending. So, so he says over in Europe, modernity winds up being heterogeneous, anachronistic, right? It's out of time and place, out of the culture and the species. It doesn't belong. In America, cinema is true because it is the whole of space, the whole way of life that are cinematic. And we really finished that off with the internet and social media. Now it's cameras and cinema anywhere, anytime, anywhere, right? Um, and I don't say that, it's not a judgment, I say that free of any of that stuff. I'm just pointing out that a new revolution did happen. It's just it was further into the light speed domain. So that is why searching for works of art or sophisticated entertainment has always seemed tiresome and out of place to me. He's right, right? And plenty of us have suffered from it. But once you kind of get over it, you just kind of realize like this is it. You just blend in, you just play along. Yeah, who doesn't like banana? Show me the banana, give me the banana. But whatever you do, don't talk about the banana. Don't theorize about the banana. Don't get intelligent about the banana. It's either a banana or a snake and nothing in between. He goes on, a mark of cultural ethnocentrism, right? He's talking about the European perspective, the cultured perspective, the enlightened perspective. Is the lack of culture that is original, then is the lack of culture one should embrace. Yes, embrace being historyless, cultureless, no idea where they came from, no idea where they're going. Just enjoy the ride. Don't question, pay your parking tickets, enjoy the ride. If the term taste has any meaning, then it commands us not to export our aesthetic demands to places where they do not belong. When the Americans transfer Roman cloisters to the New York cloisters, we find this unforgivably absurd, right? Or again, like he talks about Jay Getty collecting pieces and all these other kinds of things, right? The American Cracker Barrel or the American box of gimmicks, right? Like it's kind of it's touching, right? But like that you could just display a hodgepodge, like everything becomes a zoo basically for your display and pleasure. Fact is, our analyses in terms of alienation, conformism, standardization, dehumanization, collapse of themselves. When we look at America, it is the analyses which seem vulgar, right? The intelligence becomes vulgar in face of America. In the face of the banana, you're dumb for asking. Why would you even ask, right? So why is a passage like the following by G. Fay both true and not true at the same time? Absolutely false. California shines out as the total myth of our times. Multiracialism, hegemonic technology, shrink culture narcissism, self-obsession, urban criminality, and audiovisual saturation. As Super America, California stands out as the absolute antithesis of authentic Europe. California stands out as the absolute antithesis of authentic Europe. Right, I meant to say, I'll cut this in at the beginning maybe, but I'll leave it here actually, because from someone who I think a lot of Americans, they're not going to understand this kind of talk, and they're not going to understand Baudrillard. They're not going to understand Europe. They're not going to understand history. And as a result, they're definitely not going to understand themselves, even themselves as Americans. They're just going to say, what are you talking about? We got the banana. There's nothing to argue, right? And what he's pointing out is that I would say that, like, this analysis, if you didn't know, you would think it's an alien looking at America. And then, from there it just kind of goes. And he points out that, from Hollywood to disco pop, from E.T. to Star Wars, from the pseudo-rebellious itchings on the campus to the ravings of Carl Sagan, from the neo-Gnostics of Silicon Valley to the windsurfing mystics, from the neo-Indian gurus to aerobics, from jogging to psychoanalysis as a form of democracy, from criminality as a form of psychoanalysis to television as an instrument of despotism, California has set itself up as the world center of the simulacrum and the inauthentic as the absolute synthesis of cool Stalinism. An hysterical land. This is right. Christianity creates hysterical cultures. It's happened to Europe. It's happening in America. So, in hysterical land, focus and meeting place for the rootless California is the land of the non-history, of the non-event. But at the same time, right, just sunny all the time, at least in their imagination. But at the same time, at the site of the constant swirl, the uninterrupted rhythm of fashion, that is to say, the site of tremors going nowhere, those tremors which so obsess it, constantly threatened by its earthquakes, California has invented nothing. It has taken everything from Europe and served it up again in a disfigured, meaningless form with an added Disneyland glitter. But hey, turns out the world loves this stupid mouse. Doesn't teach anything, doesn't give anything, but people love it. That's America. That's the banana for you. World center of sweet madness, mirror of our dejecta and our decadence, Californitis, and the hot variant, or I guess, was it Californication, as the Red Hot Chili Pepper sang? That hot variant of Americanism is unleashing itself on the young of today and emerging as a mental form of AIDS, right? This is a technological revolution, really. To the revolutionary angst of the Europeans, California counterposes its long procession of fakes, the parody of science on the rightless campus, the parody of cities and urbanism in the sprawl of Los Angeles. So he's basically saying, again, if that's what America is, if it's inauthentic place of inauthentic people, then why shouldn't it all be a simulation of life? So the parody, insipid Sacramento wines, the parody of religion and its gurus and sects, the parody of eroticism and its Beach Boys, right? So basically, he's following up. If you recall, we read that quote earlier by Faze. Um, so the parody of its drugs and its acid, the parody of sociability and its quote unquote communities, even nature in California as a Hollywood parody of ancient Mediterranean landscapes. Yep, a sea that is too blue, mountains that are too rugged, a climate that is too gentle or too arid, an uninhabited, disenchanted nature, deserted by the gods, a sinister land beneath a sun that is too bright, the expressionless face of our death, since Europe will surely die sunburnt and smiling, with its skin lightly baked under a holiday sun. All this is true, if you like, since the text itself resembles the hysterical stereotype it confers upon California. It is surely easy to detect in Faye's writing a degree of fascination with the subject. But if we could use precisely the same terms to say that exactly the opposite of what he says, then this is only emphasizes the point that for his part, Fei was not able to effect this same reversal. He has not grasped how, at the edges of this meaningless world, this sweet madness of nothing, of meaninglessness, the soft air-conditioned hell he describes, things turn into their opposite. He has not grasped the challenge of this marginal transcendence in which precisely a whole universe is brought up against its margins, its hysterical simulation. And why not? Why, and this is what I was getting at a second ago, why should Los Angeles not be a parody of cities? Why should Silicon Valley not parody technology? Why should there not be a parody of sociability, eroticism, and drugs, or even indeed a parody of the too blue sea and the too bright sun? Not to mention museums and culture. Of course, all this is parody. If none of these values can bear to be parodied, it must mean they no longer have any importance. So, in terms of if you look at modern American culture, look at what myths and doublespeak and look at what ideas we used to hold true no longer hold true and vice versa, and you'll kind of see what he's getting at. It's like, so once they can't be bared to be parodied, then they no longer have importance. And that means they're going to change somehow. Change will be forced on them, that means. Yes, California and America with it is the mirror of our decadence, Europe, but it is not decadent at all. It is hyper real in its vitality. It has all the energy of the simulacrum. Like I said, we got gymnasiums just full of people pointlessly running in circles. They don't have anywhere to be. They don't have marathons to run, wars to fight, that need to expend energy, period, even, right? It is the world center of the inauthentic. It is this energy of the simulacrum. Certainly it is. That is what gives it its originality and power. The irresistible rise of the simulacrum is something you can simply feel here without the slightest effort. Right? He talks about even the banal in America attains to this superordinate sense that even though it's banality, it's extraordinary despite its banality or in its banality. So, what is new in America is the clash of the first level, primitive and wild, and the third kind, the absolute simulacrum. So, this is what he calls the fourth world. This is where classes and culture crash and just people go obsolete, become disenfranchised, become homeless, hobos, the unhoused, unhomed. There is no second level. This, right, there's nothing real. There's nothing to actually fight over. There's nothing to fight for. This is a situation we find hard to grasp, since this is the one we have always privileged. The self reflects this self mirroring level and the level of unhappy consciousness. But no vision of America makes sense without this reversal of our values. It is Disneyland that is authentic here. The cinema and TV are America's reality. The freeways, the safeways, the skylines, speed, and deserts. These are America, not the galleries, the churches, and culture. He's right. We are not an aesthetic culture. We are not an intellectual culture. Americans who feign to be European just have too much European in them still. They haven't been properly Americanized yet, which usually means carpet bombing, whether that's literally with bombs or with media. But um, let us grant this country the admiration it deserves and open our eyes to the absurdity of some of our own customs. This is one of the advantages, one of the pleasures of travel, to see and feel America. You have to have had for at least one moment in some downtown jungle, in the painted desert, and some bend in a freeway, the feeling that Europe had disappeared. I love this part right here. You have to have wondered, at least for a brief moment, how can anyone be European? And I wrote, I took a note here. Americans don't think that at all. To them, Europe doesn't even exist. It's gone. What those are backworlds, primitive people over there in their small countries with their few million people, where we have like more people in one city than those countries have in entire populations, you know. So to us, this is hilarious, and Baudrillard gets it. He understands us, he understands uh, the European mindset that is. Um, and that's just to go like, what other world? What outside world? This is the world. We are the center of the world. So, and I wrote be the comedian here, meaning John Baudrillard's being a comedian. There's the same self-advertisement, the same cult of the credit titles in the new Reagan generation, dynamic in euphoria, or rather generating dynamism and spreading euphoria, the rise of the hyper image, right? This is the 80s we're talking. These see neither the happiness as a new idea nor success as a compelling one, since they already have all these things, right? They don't mean anything anymore. They are not the militants of happiness and success, but its sympathizers. The generation that has come from the 60s and 70s, but has rid itself of all nostalgia and all bad conscious and even any subconscious memory of those wild years. The very last traces of marginality excised as if by plastic surgery. He's kind of talking about like in America, we were shedding the 60s, we were getting rid of the Vietnam syndrome, we were shedding the hippies, turning them into yuppies, turning people out back into the machine, putting on our suits and ties, getting back to work really. I put a note here. If you haven't read Ken Kesey's or I think it was Tom Wolfe's, but it was about Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Check out the electric Kool-Aid acid test to see what these decadent generations look like. They emerge, uh, they're submerged in excess wealth, and only some of them survive, and those who do have to tend to the machinery, and they make a lot of money by doing so. So we're just talking about generational shift, mission, not mission drift. This is the only mission there is. There's nothing else to do, right? That's the kind of what he's saying is there is nothing to work for because this is the utopia achieved. And he kind of goes on with this. One might have expected the orgy of the 60s and 70s to throw up a mobile, disenchanted elite, but that has not been the case. The members of this, at least in their own publicity, see themselves as mobile and enchanted. Their enchantment takes mild forms. They are motivated but not impassioned. Whether in business, politics, or data processing, they present themselves as cozily effective. I don't know if that's supposed to be cost effective. Their slogan might well be, you can't have your money and spend it too. Oh, this gets the Protestant work ethic perfect. You can't have your money and spend it too. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't eat your wife and fuck it too. You can't live your life and you're living too. I like that last one. You can't live and have your living too, right? This is the permanent dualism here. This is where he's getting to must exit his destiny. I discussed this in the last one. Baudrillard's going to paint us a picture here, and he's arriving at his estimation of America, especially as a European from the outside looking in, introvert looking into psychotically extrovert culture. So the sunsets are giant rainbows lasting for an hour. It's one of the best things about California here. The seasons here make no sense. In the morning it is spring, at noon it is summer, and the desert nights are cold without it ever being winter. It is a kind of suspended eternity in which the year is renewed daily, with the guarantee that it will be like this each day, right? Every day sunny, that every morning will be the rainbow of all the colors of the spectrum in which light, after having rained in all day long in its indivisible form, and the evening fragments into all nuances of color that make it up, right? Refracting and diffracting rainbows, before it finally disappears. Nuances which are already those of the instant rainbow catching fire in the wind on the crest of the Pacific waves. This is the invulnerable grace of the climate, privilege of a nature of the compleats, the insane richness that is man's. This country is without hope. Even its garbage is clean. Now, again, Baudrillard wrote this in the 80s. I think he'd take heart. In modern America, our trash is starting to look a little bit worse for wear. So maybe there's hope yet, right? This country is without hope. Even the garbage used to be clean. Its trade lubricated, its traffic pacified. The latent, lacteal, and lethal life is so liquid. The signs and messages are so liquid. The bodies in the cars so fluid. The hair is so blonde and soft. The teeth so white. Technology so luxuriant. Ooh, that a European dreams of death and murder, of suicide motels, of orgies and cannibalism to counteract the perfection of the ocean, of the light of that insane ease of life to counteract the hyper reality of everything here, the permanently blinding day glow white teeth. Pow, just explode your eyeballs in your skull and nothing's left of you. You're like, excuse me, I thought I was a being who had some sort of self that was relevant towards time and death. And they're just like, nope, banana, 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 banana. So, I guess I'm saying I identify with Baudrillard a bit here. Hence the fantasy of a seismic fracture and a crumbling into the Pacific Ocean, right? The Tool Anima song, which would be the end of California and of its criminal and scandalous beauty. Learn to swim, I'll see you in Arizona Bay. For it is unbearable, while one is still alive, to pass beyond the difficulty of being, simply to pass into the fluidity of sky, cliffs, surf, and deserts, into the hypothesis of happiness alone. But even the seismic challenge is still only a flirtation with death. It still forms part of the natural beauty, as do history or revolutionary theory, whose hyper-realist echoes comes here to die. So he basically saying anything authentic or real or concerned with ideals is going to die here. in the already existing utopia. The atmosphere just will not support those things. All that remains of a violent and historical demand is the graffiti on the beach facing out to sea, no longer calling upon the revolutionary masses, but speaking to the sky in an open space and the transparent deities of the Pacific, please revolution. And yet it is irrelevant that the largest naval base, that of the Pacific Seventh Fleet, the very incarnation of American worldwide domination and the greatest firepower in the world, also contributes to this insolent beauty? Question mark. In the very place where the beautiful magic of Santa Ana blows, the desert wind that crosses over the mountains to stay for 4 or 5 days before scattering the fog, or most recently the fires, scorching the earth, making the sea sparkle, and crushing those who are used to the mist. The most beautiful thing about the Santa Ana is spending the night on the beach. Hell, you can't even do that in most places. It is strictly illegal unless you get, like the permits ahead of time. Swimming there as if it were daytime and tanning like vampires under the moonlight. This country is without hope. We fanatics of aesthetics and meaning, of culture, of flavors and seduction, we who see only what is profoundly moral is beautiful and for whom only the heroic distinction between nature and culture is exciting, we who are unfailingly attached to the wonders of critical sense and transcendence find it a mental shock and a unique release to discover the fascination of nonsense and of this vertiginous disconnection, as sovereign in the cities as the deserts, right? Banana, banana tree, no banana god. To discover that one can exult in the liquidation of all culture and rejoice in the consecration of indifference. I speak of the American deserts and the cities which are not cities, no oases, no monuments, infinite panning shots over mineral landscapes and freeways. Everywhere, Los Angeles for 29 Palms, Las Vegas for Borrego Springs, oh, some of my favorites. No desire, the desert. Desire is still something deeply natural. We live off its vestiges in Europe and off its vestiges of a moribund critical culture. Here the cities are mobile deserts. No monuments and no history. The exaltation of mobile deserts and simulation. There's the same wildness in the endless indifferent cities as in the intact silence of the Badlands. Why is LA? Why are the deserts so fascinating? Is it because you are delivered from all depth there? Right? It's just you. You're forced to face yourself, and you are nothing compared to this desert. A brilliant, right? The ego just disappears. A brilliant, mobile, superficial neutrality, a challenge to meaning and profundity, a challenge to nature and culture, an outer hyperspace with no origin, no reference points, no charm, no seduction, and all this. Seduction is elsewhere, in Italy, in certain landscapes that have become paintings, as culturalized and refined in their design as the cities and museums that house them, circumscribed, traced out, highly seductive spaces where meaning, at these heights of luxury has finally become adornment. Right. So the classless society basically becomes the tasteless society. So it is exactly the reverse here. There is no seduction, right? In America, no seduction. There is absolute fascination. The fascination of the very disappearance of all aesthetic and critical forms of life in the irradiation of an objectless neutrality, immanent and solar, right? This was the light speed, piercing everything forever until the end of time. The world and man just skewered on our television sets and in our media and our mechanisms and our industry and our machinery around it. So it's pretty apocalyptic what he's talking about here. And the last thought on the desert is, it's the only thing that can swallow. It's the only thing big enough to swallow not just the American ego, but again, anything the American wants to try to place in such a hostile and uninhabitable environment of Los Angeles, insane circulation without desire, the end of aesthetics. It is not just the aesthetics of decor, of nature and architecture that vanishes into thin air, but the aesthetics of body and language, of everything that forms the Europeans, especially the Latin Europeans, mental and social habitus. That continual commedia dell'arte, that pathos and rhetoric of social relations, the dramatization of speech, the subtle play of language, the aura of makeup and artificial gesture, right? The drama, the fight, the drama, all of it. The whole aesthetic and rhetorical system of seduction, of taste, of charm, of theater, but also of contradictions, of violence, always reappropriated by speech, by play, by distance, by artifice, sophistication, of beings, not their simplification. Here's your banana. Good luck. So, our universe is never desert-like, always theatrical, always ambiguous, always cultural, and faintly ridiculous in its hereditary culturally. What is arresting here is the absence of all these things, both the absence uh, of architecture in the cities, which are nothing but long tracking shots of signals, and the dizzying absence of emotions and character in the faces and bodies. Right, like The Walking Dead, he kind of calls us that. He kind of talks about the zombie herds of America. Handsome, fluid, supple, or cool, or grotesquely obese, probably less as a result of compulsive bulimia than a general incoherence, which results in a casualness about the body or language, laziness of speech and body, right? These are the ones who aren't going to the gymnasium. They're not going to the bookshelf or the libraries. They're not maintaining body or mental hygiene. So, a loose network of individual successive functions, right? The people themselves, a bunch of cogs in the machine, a hypertrophied cell tissue proliferating in all directions, which, if you don't understand, he means cancer. Thus, the only tissue of the city that is of the freeways a vehicular, or rather incessant transurbantic tissue, the extraordinary spectacle of these thousands of cars moving at the same speed in both directions, headlights full on, broad daylight on the Ventura Freeway, coming from nowhere, going nowhere, an immense collective act, rolling along, ceaselessly unrolling, without aggression, without objective, transferentially, sociability, doubtless the only kind in a hyperreal, just starts to sound like vroom, 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 right? Like the hum of traffic, a kind in a hyperreal, technological, soft, mobile area, exhausting itself in surfaces, networks, and soft technologies. So our banana has gone flaccid. No elevator or subway in Los Angeles, no verticality or underground, no intimacy or collectivity, no streets or facades, no center or monuments. Oh yeah, you're just in your car zipping around. You're not, it's clear that like you're just meant to pass through. This is one giant liminal space. It's like one giant liminal space, and it was the utopian it was the utopian's vision of their life right before it died, right? That is the larger than life image that is California, where it's always sunny, where the beautiful and powerful play and live and come from, all those sorts of things. So the power of the desert form is that the erasure of traces in the desert, of the signified, of signs in cities, of any psychology in bodies. So he's saying like the land reflects that our bodies and minds have become like this, back to our obese people or our fat heads of the mind. An animal and metaphysical fascination, the direct fascination of space, the imminent fascination of dryness and sterility. The mythical power of California consists in this mixture of extreme disconnection and vertiginous mobility captured in the setting, the hyperreal scenario of deserts, freeway, ocean, and sun. Nowhere else does there exist such a stunning fusion of a radical lack of culture and natural beauty, of the wonder of nature, of the absolute simulacrum. Just in this mixture of extreme inferentiality and disconnection and deconnection overall, but embedded in most primeval and great featured natural scenery of deserts and ocean and sun, nowhere else is this antagonistic climax to be found. Elsewhere, sites of natural beauty heavy with meaning and nostalgia, the culture itself is unbearable in its seriousness. The strong cultures, Mexico, Japan, Islam, reflect back to us the image of our degraded one, right? They stayed true to wherever they came from in the sense that they have an old technology and an old media, and we went to the new ones. And the image of our profound guilt. The surplus of meaning in a strong ritual territorial culture turns us into gringos, zombies, tourists, kept under house arrest in the country's natural beauty spots. No such thing in California, where there is total rigor, for culture itself is a desert there. He's right, and culture has to be a desert so that everything can be equal and shine out to the same supernatural and superficial form. This is why even the flight from London to Los Angeles, passing over the pole and its stratospheric abstraction and its hyperreality, already part of California and the deserts, right? And you think about it like this, like, you leave there, you're watching a movie about Japan, and then you land in Chicago, right? Your head and your body and are in all occupying different places and spaces and time. Deterritorialization begins with the disconnection of night and day, right? This is getting into what I talked about in the first issue of America. And he ends talking about our imminent wealth. I wanted to go ahead and switch over to the book itself and say there were a few more ideas here to cover before we wrap it up. Basic extermination, metastatic consumption. Everywhere survival has become a burning issue, perhaps by some obscure wariness of life or collective desire for catastrophe, though we should not take all this too seriously. It is also playing at catastrophe, right? You're either playing at it or you're managing it. You're for or you couldn't harm it. You couldn't be for or against it at this point, is what matters. Certainly, this whole panoply of survival issues, dieting, ecology, saving the sequoias, seals, or the human race tends to prove that we are very much alive, just as all imaginary fairy tales tend to prove that the real world is very real, right? How the real world became a fable. But this is not so certain, for not only is the fact of living not really well attested, but the paradox of this society, America, is that you cannot even die in it anymore since you are already dead. Oh, this cracked me up when I read it, right? And at most, you're just an inconvenience, easily replaceable, easily combustible, not a big deal. We turned it into an art. There's a whole service industry around being dead. And other than that, get it out of our face. This is the real suspense. It is not simply an effect of living in the nuclear age, but derives from the ease in which we now live, which makes survivors of us all. If the bombs drop, we shall neither have the time to die nor any awareness of dying. But already in our hyper protected society, we no longer have any awareness of death, right? This is the disconnect from primal reality. Since we have subtly passed over into a state, since we have subtly passed over into a state where life is excessively easy. Trying again. But already in our hyper-protected society, we no longer have any awareness of death. That's the disconnect from primal reality, since we have subtly passed over into a state where life is excessively easy, might as well be dead, and that there are no dramatic or exciting options there that don't make you an immediate menace. Right? This is what Baudrillard's lamenting. The Holocaust created an anticipatory form of such a condition. What the inmates of the concentration camps were deprived of was the very possibility of having control over their deaths, i.e., consumption, of playing, even gambling with their own deaths, making their deaths a sacrifice. They were robbed of power over their own deaths. And this is what is happening to all of us in slow homeopathic doses. By virtue of the very development of our systems, the explosions and the extermination at Auschwitz and Hiroshima still go on, though they have simply taken on a purulent endemic form, right, in the lights of the television. The chain reaction continues nonetheless. The contagion, the unfolding of the viral and bacteriological processes, the end of history was precisely the inauguration of this chain reaction. Dang. The obsessive desire for survival and not for life or power is a symptom of this state of affairs and doubtless also the worrying sign of the degradation of the species, right? And what was the species but a mythology anyway? I think the degradation is real though. If you think about the forms that desire currently takes, anti-nuclear shelters, cryogenization, high pressure therapy, you see that these are exactly the forms of extermination. To avoid dying, one chooses to withdraw into some protective bubble or another, disconnect from reality, disconnect from primal reality. In this light, we should take it to as a reassuring sign that people lost interest in anti-nuclear protection so quickly. The shelter market has become a mere prestige market, like the market for artworks and luxury yachts. It seems that people have become tired of nuclear blackmail and decided not to give in to it, leaving the threat of destruction hanging midair over them. Everyone is weary of these apocalyptic visions, right? And we kind of ran out of good movies about them too. Good movies and shows. Been scraping the bottom of the barrel with your Hunger Games and Maze Runners and that kind of thing. The great scenario of the nuclear threat, the theatrical negotiations, Star Wars, right? Cosmic opera. It's like Gnosticism, basically. In the end, they defend themselves with a lack of imagination. Even attempts to stimulate that imagination in films like The Last Day have not worked. Nothing has ever been able to make this nuclear scene or obscenity credible. With delicate matters like this, as with cancer, imagining death has the effect of bringing the fatal event closer. The masses' silent indifference to nuclear pathos, whether it comes from the nuclear powers or from anti-nuclear campaigners, is therefore a great sign of hope and political fact of the utmost importance. Another hilarious moment from Baudrillard because you see this sort of banality everywhere. Live or die, the graffiti message on the pier at Santa Monica is mysterious because we really have no choice between life and death. If you live, you live. If you die, you die. It is like saying be yourself or don't be. It is stupid and yet it is enigmatic, right? Perfect American slogan. You could read it to mean that you should live intensely or else disappear, but that is banal, and honestly par for the course. Following the model of pay or die, your money or your life, it would become your life or your life. Stupid again, since you cannot exchange life for itself. And yet there is a poetic force in this implacable tautology, as there always is when there is nothing to be understood. In the end, the lesson of this graffiti is perhaps if you get more stupid than me, you die. Where the others spend their time in libraries, I spend mine in the deserts and on the roads. Where they draw their material from the history of ideas, I draw mine from what is naive. So you have to be naive. Everything here still bears the mark of a primitive society. Technologies, the media, total simulation, bio, socio, stereo, video are developing in a wild state, in their original state. Insignificance exists on a grand scale and the desert remains the primal scene even in the big cities. Inordinate space, a simplicity of language and character. My hunting grounds are the deserts, the mountains, Los Angeles, the freeways, the safeways, the ghost towns, or the downtowns, not lectures at the university. I know the deserts, their deserts, better than they do, since they turn their backs on their own space as the Greeks turned their back on the sea, and I get to know more about the concrete social life of America from the desert than I would ever know from official or intellectual gatherings. Yes, I mentioned this earlier. If you want to know and understand America, travel across it, visit it, see how the people live, see what they do, see how the cuisine and the diets and the ways of life varies city to city, state to state, coast to coast. I think we're already like devolving or changing into different subspecies anyway. So, to the degree that lightning already struck, America just makes it that much more apparent, makes the distance greater. Speaking of greater distance, here we have Baudrillard talking about a certain perception of history, and he says, when I see Americans, particularly American intellectuals, casting a nostalgic eye towards Europe, its history, its metaphysics, its cuisine, and its past, I tell myself that this is just a case of unhappy transference. History and Marxism are like fine wines and cuisine. They do not really cross the ocean, in spite of many impressive attempts that have been made to adapt them to new surroundings. Right? America is very pretentious in this regard. They imitate well. This is a just revenge for the fact that we Europeans have never really been able to domesticate modernity, which also refuses to cross the ocean, though in the other direction. There are products which cannot be imported or exported. That is our loss, and theirs. If for us society is a carnivorous flower, history for them is an exotic one, right? This gets into the American psyche. Its fragrance is no more convincing than the bouquet of California wines, in spite of all the effort being expended to make us believe otherwise, right? As if this came from France. Not only can history not be caught up, but it seems that in this capitalist society, capital can never actually be grasped in its present reality. It is not that our Marxist critics have not tried to run after it, but it always stays a length ahead of them. By the time one phase has been unmasked, capital has already passed onto another. It cheats, it doesn't play by the rules of the critique, right? That's intelligence for you, because capital is intelligence. The true game of history. It eludes the dialectic because it's not even talking to anyone. It's talking to a small cadre or coterie. It's got its own conspiracy and it doesn't need everyone else, at least not their opinions or ideas. It eludes the dialectic, which only reconstitutes it after the event, a revolution behind. Even anti-capitalistic revolutions only serve to give a fresh impetus to its own. They are the equivalent of the exogenous events. And look, I'll say it for American intellectuals don't seem to understand that they are the small minority. They can read Marx all they want, but the rest of the country is just working. That's all they're doing. It's that banal, really. And that also, most of the country doesn't read. So you're not going to get them to read Marx. You're not going to get them to care about Marx. You're not going to get them to, you can kind of go from there. But ultimately, you're talking about a small minority of the world's top minority wealthy population anyway. So, like, no one's playing violins for the poor Americans. Do you understand? And I mean, literally, the middle class Americans, but also the homeless. Um, Going on here. So even if Mendel speaks like wars, crises, or the discovery of gold mines, which set capital off and new developmental processes on fresh bases, in the end, these theorists themselves reveal the inanity of their hopes. By reinventing capital in each successive phase on the basis of the primacy of political economy, they simply confirm the absolute initiative capital enjoys as historical event. They therefore fall straight into their own trap and give themselves no chance of getting ahead of it. And this is at the same time ensures, as was perhaps the objective, the continuing validity of their retrospective analyses. Right, if you couldn't prove that you were right by being wrong, what would be the point of writing a critique? You'd have nothing to say. You know, like they're wrong and I'm right, so let me prove it by writing it. Writing's got to be a mental illness, right? Um, there's a few other parts that I thought were worth bringing up before I bring this to a close. America has never been short on violence nor of events, people, or ideas, but these things do not themselves constitute a history. Octavio Paz is right when he argues that America was created in the hope of escaping from history, of building a utopia sheltered from history. This is the big one, and it has in part succeeded in that project, a project it's still pursuing today to stop history. The concept of history as the transcending of a social and political rationality, as a dialectical, conflictual vision of societies, is not theirs. It's not American. It's not American at all. America is a story of Nike. Just do it. Victory. Banana, banana, banana. Right? Nothing to do with idealism. Nothing to do with philosophy. Nothing to do with smart monkey use brain for smart making. Very simply, it's what you see is what you get. We are an extroverted culture, and psychopathy is the name of the game. So, the concept of history as the transcending of a social and political rationality as a dialectical, conflictual vision of societies is not theirs, just as modernity, conceived precisely as an original break with a certain history, right? Getting away from old Europe, that stuffy old place who blew itself up, right, will never be ours. So he's recognizing that Europeans can't be American and Americans can't be Europeans, despite what we share and what we don't share. We have lived long enough now in the unhappy consciousness of this modernity to be aware of that. Europe invented a certain kind of feudalism, aristocracy, bourgeoisie, ideology, and revolution, and all this had meaning for us. It had meaning for Europe. Americans can only have pretensions to these things. But at bottom, it had no meaning elsewhere. All who have tried to ape these things have either made themselves a laughing stock or have been dramatically driven off course. I think we see this in America too, even with our leftism. We ourselves are doing little more than merely imitating ourselves, outliving ourselves. Europe and America too, honestly, at this point. America made a break with all that and found itself in simulation. Well, I see, and I guess that's it. He said situation, but in terms of simulation, I would say that, if you can just stay in simulation forever, then you don't need history. You don't need reality and people or whatever else makes reality happen. Um, is therefore in America and nowhere else that modernity is original. We can imitate it without being able to challenge it on its home territory. Once an event has taken place, it has taken place, full stop. When I see Europe casting longing eyes towards all out modernity, I tell myself that too is all unhappy transference. Right, so now we've covered both of them. When Americans cast their eyes to Europe and when Europe's cast their eyes to America, neither knows what each other has, neither knows what each other is missing. We're still at the center, but at the center of the old world, right? And it's a small world. Europe is an old, small world. Like China outnumbers Europe, India outnumbers Europe. They who were a marginal transcendence of that old world are today its new eccentric center. Eccentricity is stamped on their birth certificate. We shall never be able to take it from them. That's America. We shall never be able to excenter or decenter ourselves in the same way. We shall therefore never be modern in the proper sense of the term. And we shall never enjoy the same freedom, not the formal freedom we take for granted, but the concrete, flexible, functional, active freedom we see at work in American institutions, in the head of each citizen, in our commercials, right? In our education centers, everywhere at work, you see this. Our conception of freedom will never be able to rival their spatial mobile conception, which derives from the fact that at a certain point they freed themselves from that historical centrality. So so if God died in Europe, then his blast wave only helped push us further away. From the day when that eccentric modernity was born in all its glory and electricity on the other side of the Atlantic, Europe began to disappear. Right. Like I said, Europe actually hasn't been culturally relevant for decades, haven't been militarily relevant for decades. They don't even have their own militaries or, compared to America, you wouldn't even call those armies. Those are puny little I don't know, those are what do you call it? Lessons in futility from a military perspective, or maybe you would call being outclassed, outgunned, and outnumbered, right? A lost cause if you actually try to fight wars with those militaries. So it's not just that Europe's culture has been irrelevant for decades. It's that the people and the culture are relevant, and also that America is their military backbone. And it depends who you are because we won't necessarily care, stop, or do anything to help, right? So everyone knows that. It will do us no good to worry our poor little heads over this. In Los Angeles, Europe has disappeared. As Isabel Huppert says, they have everything. They don't need anything, right? This is America everywhere, really. Admittedly, they envy us and our past and our culture and admire them, but deep down to them, we are sort of elegant third world. It's pretty true. Like, again, and I'd say it again that for most Americans, Europe just doesn't exist, or who even cares, right? In the political sphere, there will always remain of this initial decentering a federalism, an absence of centralism, and at the level of mores and culture, a decentralization and eccentricity which is that of the New World relation to Europe. The U.S. has no insoluble problem of federation. They have, of course, had their war of secession, but that came and went. But we're speaking here of the current federal setup because they are from the outset, from the very dawn of their history, a culture of mixing, of national and racial mix, of rivalry and heterogeneity. Geneity is clearly visible in New York, where each successive skyscraper, and that of its own fashion, each ethnic group has dominated the city, where the whole, none of the less, still gives this impression not of I guess it's like what's his name? Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, right? Where he says is clearly visible in New York, where just where he says that the attitude at the heart of America is winner take nothing, and that the moment that that changes, winner take something or everything, it's done for basically. But converging energies, not unity or plurality, but of intensity, born of rivalry, of antagonistic power, thus creating a complicity, a collective attraction beyond culture or politics, and the very attraction beyond culture or politics and the very violence or banality of the way of life. If we stay with the line of thinking, we can see that there is a profound difference in a racial ethnic tone between America and France. Talking about the violence of mixing. Yes, America is a very mixed place. We might be the mutt of history, but we wound up top dog, is another way of putting it. And then lastly, what Baudrillard gets into in America is disenfranchisement. And I covered it in previous videos, including ones that weren't necessarily about Jean Baudrillard and America, but basically he's talking about as we create technology and classes that work hand in hand together, we basically obsolesce them. So in terms of what that means in American civics is it's easy, people grow up here all the time thinking, hey, I'm a person, I have a family and a nation and a state, but then before long it's like they lose their job, they're out on the street and then they're homeless and then or they're mentally insane or they turn into criminals or do any number of things. But the point is there is a disenfranchisement that's always happening here that people are getting churned and ejected from the culture. So let's take one more look at that to see how that happened because he kind of talks about with the Reagan coterie how once that happened that like the poor and downtrodden would never be a concern for America again. The working class, the working stiffs, the blue collars, the white collars, this concern over the poor, the non-wealthy, like that this would never be a problem again. And basically what he says is that, you lose your rights one at a time. First it's your job, then your car, then your driver's license. Once you lost your license, you're a non-person. In modern terms, you're arguably, once you're out of childhood, you're arguably a non-person, just because we have such a again, that culture that's afraid of silence. When no one can sit okay with themselves, you don't even have to worry about being a self. You don't have to worry about despair or any of that, because no one has a healthy or a realistic relationship to life, death, work, reality, other human beings. Without having the resources to protect yourselves from the worst parts of this culture is a desert, and it will swallow you up and devour you alive. I think that's kind of the point of what he's talking about with the disenfranchisement. So even right now, thinking, hey, we're coming out of these tech revolutions. What kind of classes and peoples are now obsolete? What kind of tech is now obsolete? What models of business? So where do all these people go? What happens? It'll be just like Europe after the serfs were freed, and the aristocrats noted like, hey, there's these lazy bums everywhere. If we're not already there, we're getting there. Anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time to check out the channel. Again, we've been looking at John Baudrillard's America. Again, outsiders look in, like getting an alien view of the culture from someone who actually knows it, right? It would only seem alien to someone who's buried in it. And that covers it for today. Hey, did you notice that? Nothing changed. Anyway, again, I'm Zach Markowski. Today we've been looking at Jean Baudrillard's America. Thanks for your time, your attention. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, ask questions on Baudrillard, philosophy, America, whatever you like. Converse amongst yourselves. If you know someone who'd like the content, please share it with them, because it's not the easiest thing in the world to market, nor does YouTube actually market its creators. Anyway, take care, and if we're so fortunate to be here tomorrow, I'll catch you then. That's what it's like to be an American, because like you're programmed from an early age. You don't necessarily think like, oh, my childhood was shaped by marketers, but it absolutely was.